Glad to be here. Want to talk to you guys about a talk I gave at a few places, people, process, tools in that order. And I, I really started to gravitate towards this as I found us in the technology space sort of like always backing into these technical decisions. And I'll talk a little bit about that. But I think at the crux of the issue is like, um, we forget that like at the end of the day we're all people, right? And people have emotions and feelings, and we tend to think that we're all sort of like rational actors, but in reality we're bringing all of this baggage with us, whether it be personal, professional, but all of that baggage sort of goes into our decision making process. So when we talk about tool selection, a lot of times we sort of ignore that component and we march forward in this world of like, well, everyone is clearly going to be a rational thinker about this. And all I need to do is deliver exactly what they want. But if you've ever tried to implement something new, you probably know that that doesn't always pay off the way you thought it would. Um, and the way that we sort of talk about that at Centro is we said that sometimes things happen to you, not through you. And what we mean by that is um, when you're not involved with creating or designing or developing a process, it doesn't feel like it feels like it's happening to you, right? Like this process change is some sort of affront, and it doesn't matter if the process is solving exactly the problem that you have. When you weren't involved in sort of like the decision making, a process around it, you're immediately a little defensive about it. You're immediately sort of hostile to the idea. And I don't know if this is something that's sort of ingrained in our minds as some sort of like survival instinct or something, but it's a pattern that I see over and over again where given this team's, leaving this team to their own devices, they would design exactly what I'm bringing to them. But because they weren't involved in the process, there's a lot of pushback. So when we think about that, I think about the different orders that we could try to address these things, right? And if we talk about tools, process, and people, what ends up happening is you pick a tool and then you develop this cumbersome process to support the tool, and then you bring this package solution to the people and the people reject it. They're like, no, we're not going to do this. If you go tools, people, process, then you sort of run into an issue where people want to do things a little bit differently that doesn't match the tool that you selected. The story that I always think about this stuff is like with Kubernetes, right? Like you go to you deploy Kubernetes and you've got this great workflow, but if you didn't involve the developers, they're going to shoot down all of the workflows that you sort of come up with because they're not involved with the process. Um, if you go process, people, tools, then you're kind of forcing people into a workflow that they don't generally agree with. And process, tools, people is just like a total explosion. So the order has to be people, process, then tools. You get the people on board with the vision. Together, you define what the process is going to look like to deliver on that vision. And then with that information, you use that as part of your tool selection process. Um, and we kind of just talked about that, so I'll go ahead and skip that slide. So quick introduction. I know Garrett gave me a quick one, but my name is Jeff Smith. I'm the Director of Production Operations at a company here in Chicago called Centro. We're a digital advertising software company. Previous to that, I was a manager of site reliability at Grubhub. I just recently wrote a book. I guess it wasn't that recent. It came out in like November, but it early released because Manning has like this early release program. So it feels like it's been out for a year and a half, but it's really only been a few months. But Operations Anti-Patterns DevOps Solutions, where I talk about a lot of the sort of anti-patterns that I see in DevOps workflows and DevOps teams and organizations generally, and how to go about trying to solve those in real practical ways, right? Nowhere am I recommending technology. It's just like, hey, here's some processes that you can do. And then I just recently launched a website, attainabledevops.com. It's really just a placeholder for now. But if you want to look for me, that's where you would find me. I'm also pretty active not pretty active, but I'm on Twitter. I've been pretty active the last few days because of this whole Basecamp saga, but that's a whole nother conversation. So when we talk about this people process tools methodology, right? The first thing that I think we need to do is sort of create this shared vision of what it is that we're trying to accomplish. We want to make sure that we have as many people on board as possible. And what's interesting is when you start with a tool, really the tool and its implementation becomes the goal, and it muddies what it is that you want that tool to actually do. So by going through the whole people process tools pattern in that particular order, you have to be able to share this vision with the people that you're going to be working with so that we're all on board with the goal of what we're actually trying to do. So I'll give you a quick story that my boss tells, and my boss is Russian. He grew up in the Soviet Union era, and he was telling me the story where it's like, okay, there's a new supervisor that gets dispatched to this team, and there's the team is responsible for like planting trees, and there's a guy that's digging a hole, right? And then another guy comes up behind him and fills the hole. They do it again. They dig a hole. The guy comes behind him, fills the hole. And after watching this a few times, he stops the group and he says, what are you two doing? What's going on? I don't understand what's happening. And they're like, well, I dig the hole and he fills the hole. And he's like, why? That doesn't make any sense. And they're like, oh, right, you're new. I forgot. Yeah. The guy that's supposed to plant the tree is off today. So it makes you stop and think like, how many times are we just doing our job without a full understanding of where it fits into the larger context, right? How many times are we just sort of digging and filling a hole without thinking about the larger impact of what it is that we're trying to deliver from an organizational perspective? That is so easy to get caught up in, specifically in operations, where you are sort of like so far removed from the product that you don't even think of yourself as part of that product pipeline sometimes. So the key is making sure that all team members know the overall strategy beyond their individual area of responsibility, right? Everyone has to understand what it is that we're trying to accomplish as a goal, because sometimes we're going to have to optimize for the whole. Sometimes you might have to do something in your area that is maybe suboptimal for you, but is particularly useful or healthy for the rest of the organization. I'll give you another example of that. We have a scenario where, because of a gem that we use for feature flag management, every time we want to add a particular user group to a set of feature flags, if the flag is brand new, we have to modify a config file and deploy it. Now, we've got configuration management to do that, right? So it's not a big deal, but we've got to restart all of the web servers for them to pick up the new config. And it's a pain in the ass. So I said, guys, we need to come up with a way where this stuff can be dynamically loaded in the database. It doesn't make a ton of sense for us to do a rolling restart just to enable a feature for a group of users. And they sat me down and they were like, well, Jeff, here's the deal. We use this gem. This gem is sort of all over the place. It only works with configuration. Here's what we've done to try to get it out of the database, because to get it into the database, because we had that same feeling. But really, we're talking about 6 to 8 months worth of work, most likely, because we're going to be dealing with forking an open source project, maintaining that. And it's just a heavy lift. So in lieu of what it is that we're trying to accomplish as an organization, one of them isn't necessarily redesigning feature flag gems. So we said, okay, we'll continue on the path and we'll just try to make it as safe and as automated as possible. We had to optimize for the whole, even though it created more work in our team, but it was worthwhile because the work that we were going to do in our team was incredibly less impactful than the work that the development team would have to do. Another part of sort of optimizing for the whole is like you got to kind of understand the value that all the parts of the process bring, right? So that means security, that means ops, that means design, UI, UX, product. Everyone has to have an understanding of what it is that each team is contributing to the pipeline. And I think this is especially true when you start looking at operations and security organizations, because like when you talk about security, it's often treated in this sort of adversarial light or adversarial relationship, when in reality, the security team really just wants to make sure that what you're delivering is secure, reasonably secure, and that risks that exist in the environment are known. People always think that if there's any little bit of risk in a security organization, that security freaks out. And really, security teams are largely about like, do we know about this risk and are we accepting it as an organization? So the value that they bring isn't saying no, it's surfacing risk and making sure we're all aware of it so that when we do it, we're doing it eyes wide open. But so often these sort of support teams get lost in that shuffle and we forget about what it is that they're adding to the organization or to the delivery pipeline. So it's important that we understand all the parts of the process and that we bring everyone together in terms of the value that they're adding. Someone also needs to overlook the process as a whole, right? Because even though, we all want to be on the lookout for how we can help as a group, we're still going to all sort of sub-optimize for our individual area. So who is looking at the overarching process and making decisions around that? My opinionated version is it should be product. But I've, gotten to several virtual knife fights over that. No one's really had a good idea who it should be, but it is what it is. Priorities is another area where we can help with this sort of shared vision and defining, getting people on board together. Teams can often operate independently, which means planning happens independently. And people think that, oh, well, we've got these individual cross-functional teams and we don't have those problems. And I typically call BS, right? Because there's always some dependency on another team somewhere, right? Like there's always some minor interaction that is required, or maybe I need this other team to add data to an API request or an API response that they don't currently use in like a microservices environment, or maybe I need ops to deliver some additional infrastructure for this new service that I'm building. The problem is when we don't have organizational priorities properly defined, and not just stating that this is important, but actually ranking them, it creates friction. And the example that I give is like, let's say we've got 4 teams, right? Team Alpha, Team Bravo, Team Charlie, and Team Delta, right? And the P's are their priority projects. So the P1 project for the Alpha team is Project A. The P1 for Bravo team is B, the project for C, so on and so forth, right? And as these priorities start to get juggled up, you quickly run into a scenario where if there is some sort of conflict in that schedule, then suddenly you're stuck waiting on a team to deliver something that's important to you, but isn't important to them. Delta's team, P1 is Project D, but it's it's a P4 for the Alpha team. So how do you resolve that? How do you create an environment where there's not that sort of friction? So there's a certain level of prioritization that needs to happen universally. As individual contributors, for those of us that are individual contributors and aren't in management, we don't necessarily set the priorities, but we can always ask, even demand for clarification on the priorities. And I find that managers are particularly bad at this sometimes, but it's like everything can't be a priority or nothing is. So I need rankings, right? I need, if you want me to do this work, I need to understand what work is okay to slip, what work is okay to fall back on. And as individual contributors or team leads, that's something that we can push our leadership for. Yes, I know A, B, C, and D are important, but which ones are the most important for me and which ones are the most important for the organization? So that when I get confronted with a conflict, I know how to resolve it from a priority standpoint without having to go to you as a senior leader or whatever every single time that pops up. So my saying is always priorities are your shield. They're your defense for saying no. And as long as priorities are clearly understood, and as long as priorities are well defined, it's easy to say, I can't do that because this is my top priority right now. Shared metrics of success, another way to get people on board together, moving in the same direction. Nassim Nicholas Taleb, he wrote like I think he calls it the Concerto series of books, Skin in the Game, Anti-Fragile, and I think there's two others. But one of the books, I believe it was Skin in the Game, has my favorite called Bureaucracy is a construction by which a person is conveniently separated from the consequences of his or her actions, right? And if we break that down, basically what we're saying is like, I can make a choice and there's actually no blowback on me if that choice is wrong. When he was talking about it, he was really talking about like economic decisions, right? Like, I think he was specifically addressing down the banking industry, right? They can make a bunch of bad choices, but we know that the government's going to bail us out. So we're not necessarily responsible for those choices. But we see that in technology all the time, right? We see a choice in tooling that may trickle down to an operations group and they have to deal with the fallout from that. Or a language choice that is difficult to support and other people are sort of pulled into it. But the person that made that decision is off the hook. So we need to make sure that everyone sort of has skin in the game, right? We talk about this phase 2 decision all the time too, right? Where when a decision is made, a developer is confronted with the impact of their choice. And it's really like, do we spend the extra 4 weeks making sure that this thing is reliable, but we miss our deadline? Let's say we're arguing about reliability. Or do I accept the current reliability to the deadline and promise to correct it later, right? I think all of us have seen that, oh, well, we'll fix it in phase 2. When a developer has skin in the game, those choices become radically different. If the developer is the one that's going to get the page for that unreliable system, the choice structure changes. If product is on the hook for reliability just as much as operations is, that incentivizes them to understand the trade-offs between shipping more features and or focusing on reliability. If product is on the hook for known security vulnerabilities, right, that haven't been patched, it changes that calculus. So these shared measures of success are like, how do we collaborate in a way that we are being measured on similar statistics, similar characteristics of the system? Who's feeling the pain of the choice and how are they measured as a result of that choice? Another big thing is that the person responsible have complete control over the metrics that we're tracking them on, right? So nothing is more frustrating, and this was one of the things that I think that led to DevOps is because we didn't have those shared metrics, operations was being measured by this thing, uptime, which they really had very little control of outside of a drastic hardware failure, right? If security teams are measured by the number of bugs or vulnerabilities in a particular piece of software, right, they need to be empowered to be able to solve that. And if they're not, then it's a completely unfair scenario that they're being measured by that metric. But for some reason, whenever we're designing these metrics, we tend to design them based on silos, right? Well, developers ship code, so they should be measured for how many lines of code they're shipping or how many releases they're doing. Well, guess what? They can't release without the help and coordination of operations. So why isn't operations measured by that same metric? So when we're creating these shared metrics, we have to understand who's feeling the pain of the choice. Are the people that are being measured by this, do they have control over the ability to deliver on that metric? So some common scenarios for this is like developers not on call for the services they support. That's something that we talk a lot about now that is becoming more in vogue. I don't think it's ubiquitous yet, but there are plenty of organizations that are starting to roll that way and are getting a lot of success. Where you get muddy with that is, when you start talking about like monoliths, right? So which team is actually responsible for supporting the monolith? Um, Support staff are not consultant in technology choices. Um, for a long time, that has been sort of mitigated by operations being the gatekeeper to production and sort of putting a stranglehold on what it is that can make it to production to the detriment of development, right? So now it's like, well, this is great that we're doing this, but unfortunately, we're still running, Postgres 8. Groups that prioritize development work are not responsible for reliability. We talked a lot about that. And developers are responsible for troubleshooting, but don't get the access they need. And that's a big one because so often we say, hey, I can't fix this. This is a code issue. And the developer says, okay, sweet. Can I get access to the system? No, you don't. Do I have any metrics or logs in a centralized place, right? Like, do I have everything I need to be able to do this? And, it creates a scenario where a lot of times developers are hamstrung by production operations, and production operations sort of serves as this sort of like a stenographer for developers, when instead we could be figuring out, all right, what are the common problems that developers are running into, and how do we automate those things so that they can do it? Because 9 times out of 10, a developer doesn't need to do anything crazy. They're just like, oh, we need to, restart a service or something like that. Process. So we talked about the people part, how we're going to get people on board. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the process. And people freak out when they hear the word process. But all a process is a series of actions or steps taken in order to achieve a particular end. And I define it and say it to mean that even though you don't think you have a process for a thing, you have a process for a thing. The question is that process controlled in any way, or is it just sort of random chaos? But either way, the things are getting done. So there's a process that exists for it. The process just may not be well understood. So when I talk with people, they sort of like cower at first at the idea of process. Oh, we don't want to be so super formal. And it's like, it's not about formality. It's about defining what it is so that other people can follow in their footsteps. So for an example, let's take an ad hoc process, right? There is so much that we lose in terms of flexibility when we're dealing with ad hoc processes. So if we're looking at the flow chart, right, someone develops a change, they commit the change, all those are normal, right? But then it starts to split up based on the team we're dealing with. If we're dealing with Team Alpha, they go through a PR approval process. If the PR is approved, they execute unit testing. If the unit testing passes, they deploy to production. Great. Team Bravo, if they do unit testing, if the unit tests pass, they go back and develop changes. Or if the unit tests pass, I'm sorry, they deploy straight to production, right? So they're doing unit testing before any sort of PR approval. They're not even doing PR approval. Team Charlie does unit testing. If it passed, then they do the PR approval process. If the PR approval process goes through, it gets deployed to the staging. If it goes to staging, it goes through a regression test, then it gets deployed to production. So these are 3 distinct processes that are only changed based on teams. But the problem is, because the process is so ad hoc, if we were to automate it or try to talk about it generally, there are no solid assumptions that we can make about the life cycle of a piece of code. There are no assumptions that we can make on, like, how does the code get from a local developer's workstation to production? So as a result of not being able to make those assumptions, we can't really do any easy automation around this because we have to have all these caveats. Well, if the PR came from Team Alpha, then we know that this is going to happen. But if it's Team Charlie, we need to do it a slightly different way. So these ad hoc processes end up creating a lot of difficulty and complexity around automating this stuff. Because it's not to say that you can't automate it. It just means the stuff that you write to automate it is probably going to look like hot garbage. So when we're talking about automation specifically, but with processes, predictability is key because automation is powered through predictability. And predictability is going to require a structured process instead of this crazy, like, sort of ad hoc process. We need to be able to make particular assumptions about the life cycle of a commit. So an example that I use for this is bars, right? You remember bars back when we used to go outside and see people? So at a bar, what happens, right? You get there and you get to the front door, and a bartender or a bouncer checks your ID. And once he checks your ID, he lets you in. But once you're in, we know that everyone has gone through that process. So now when you go to the bar, you don't have to show ID, because we know that if you're in the bar, you've already been ID'd and I can serve you. Now, if we didn't do it this way, if we had an ad hoc process, the bartender would have to check every single person as they order their drink, which would slow down the pipeline at the bar. Sure, there's certain drawbacks, right? There may be a drawback where, like, if you've got an 18-year-old designated driver, they can't hang out with you because they've got to be 21 to get into a bar. Or you might have an issue where someone sees the line, and as a result of the line to get in to get their ID checked, they think the entire bar is crowded and they skip and they go somewhere else. I'm not saying it's perfect. I'm not saying any process is perfect. All processes are going to have their trade-offs, right? But being able to make assumptions about the process and what has gone through it will allow you so much greater flexibility in how you handle things later on in the chain. So predictability in practice is like making decisions based on well-established expectation. Peer review serves as an implicit approval process, right? So if we know that we're going to put things through a peer review process, we know that this thing has been approved by someone else. And that opens up a whole host of options for us in terms of, like, things like audits and security, right? Like, how do we know that this has been approved, right? What change management process did it go through? A lot of times in my audits, I'm pointing to my PR process. Well, this can't get to production without two approvals from someone, and that's justified. And they say, oh, okay, and everything goes through peer review? Yes, everything goes through peer review because you can't merge to master without it. It sounds simple, but it's amazing how many folks don't look at it as a benefit outside of just the standard Git flow work process. Um, Rehearsal deployments in lower environments is another example, right? How do we get better at doing deployments? Now, I know some people are gung-ho on continuous deployment, and if you're there, that's wonderful. But still, people want to see that the process works. So they want to see this sort of like predictable pattern of behavior. So it's like it gets committed, we run unit tests, we deploy to staging, we run a bunch of end-to-end tests, and then from there we deploy to production. And as long as all those steps have happened, everyone seems happy. Process also helps with quantitative data because now we have clear checkpoints that we can examine the process to make sure that things are working as they should be. So since the process is predictable, automation can be leveraged to test a failure. We can get more accurate breakdowns on where issues are occurring because we know that the process is going to be fairly standard. So we can ask ourselves, well, how do we get data out of this particular phase, and how do we radiate that data so that we can make better decisions about it? If we know that everything is going to go through this unit test pipeline, how do we then start pulling out metrics to say, is this unit test pipeline too fast, too slow, too many errors? Where are we falling out in terms of error rates during the testing process? Things of that nature. Predictability, though, is also an ingredient for reliability. Your reliability is based on predictable patterns of usage. So how do you gauge predictability, right? Part of it is going into production-like environments beforehand. How are you validating against factors like volume, concurrency, things like that? These are things that you have to think about in your staging environments to make sure that every change is being exercised through these mechanisms. And once they're exercised, we have confidence in what things are going to look like. This is a bit of an aside. So we're doing like a product review, so to speak, of our automation infrastructure at Centro. And one of the things that we used to do is we used to have all these levers and features that people could toggle in the automation for different things, right? Like, give me a bigger database, give me a database with a BI export node for Sidekick workers, give me 4 Sidekick workers, give me 8 Sidekick workers, give me, larger web servers. We gave them all this flexibility and configuration because when we talked to a handful of power users, it was suggested that's what they wanted. But when we started talking to other engineers that weren't the superpower users, the more 80% of the audience, most of them didn't want any of that. They were like, I just want confidence that this thing is going to work. Everything else is a means to an end. So if I get that confidence through process, where we're just doing a bunch of automated testing, that's fine. If I get that confidence through deploying or delivering to a very production-like environment, and I'm doing that over and over again, and the signal is clean and clear when that's not working or accurate, that's all I really care about. All of the other stuff is really just a means to an end. And that really sort of changed our focus on how we wanted environments and code to flow through test environments to make sure that it's predictable. And in order to make it predictable, we said maybe we don't need all of these levers that people change, because every time they change it, something new is being introduced into the environment. But alas, there's no free lunches. Process does mean less freedom in certain areas, more freedom in others, right? So while you may be stuck down a golden yellow brick road in order to get a certain thing done, right? Staying on that path gives you freedom in other areas where you can deploy faster, you can move with more speed. So it's not all a loss. I think the benefits outweigh the costs, and I think you get that freedom that you're missing from other means. What we try to often do is when we come up with processes, we say like, all right, here's the golden path, and here's all the little tips and tricks that we're going to do for you to make sure that this is easy and smooth. But if you don't want to go that route, that's fine, but you still have to deliver on all these other things that we're giving to you for free. You have to solve those on your own. That gives people the option if they're really, really motivated to do things a different way. But 9 times out of 10, folks are like, well, yeah, I'll do the golden path because then I know my patches are being applied. Then I know I'm using a certified Docker container. Then I know I'm getting metrics and monitoring and all of that stuff. So the choosing tools part is actually the shortest part of the conversation to me, because there's a ton of tools out there. And to me, choosing a tool is only difficult when you don't really know what you're actually solving for. And what I mean by that is, if you understand what's important, you can focus in on those key areas and end up eliminating a lot of the tools that are available to you in terms of if you're choosing a new tool. So if you understand that we are trying to resolve problem X, Y, and Z, well, you look at the tools that are focusing on that. And there's a lot of tools that try to do everything. So you're like, okay, we can eliminate these because these things do X, Y, and Z the best. And you've got your people on board and you've together designed this process. So it makes it really easy to figure out, okay, what is the stuff that sifts to the top? And then what is the stuff that is just like, okay, these are cool features, right? And we can discuss that, but it's not 100% germane to what it is that we're trying to solve for. So we don't have to consider it as heavily. And honestly, once you get down to like, 2 or 3 tools to choose from, 9 times out of 10, you're going to end up hating whatever tool you pick anyways, right? You're just going to hate it for different reasons. Because, once we get more familiar with things, we begin to understand its limitations. And if we try to like break out of the sort of systematic cage that they've built for us, as we don't accept the trade-offs that the tool that we chose made, we become to get frustrated. So once you've got like your requirements defined, and you can narrow your tool choice down very, very shortly. Like for us, a lot of times we're like, let's look at the community, right? Is it a community that we want to be a part of? And we use that to help drive a lot of it, because once you adopt a tool, it's almost like a marriage of sorts. So again, if the process is well defined, understanding your must-haves versus your nice-to-haves is much, much easier to do. Talk to your peers. Don't be afraid of process and structure, but really have those conversations with people around you, people that are going to be involved, stakeholders, stakeholders from other areas. Get their input as well. The more people that you get the input on, the more they feel like they've been in on that conversation, the more successful you'll be when you're defining your process. And then choosing your tool is a walk in the park. We found that most people, once we've defined the people in the process, most people don't even really even care about which tool choice it is, because they know it's going to deliver on what it is that we define was important. So quick recap: people, process, tools in that order. Create shared metrics of success across your teams, and everyone should understand the goals for what it is that we're trying to accomplish. Decision makers should never be divorced from the consequences of those decisions. They should always have a little bit of skin in the game. Process breeds predictability, and predictability will allow for more freedom. And predictability is an ingredient of reliability. So that's all I've got for you guys today. Bunch of contact info that I can definitely share through